So great. So I don't have to do that. Yay. So if you guys have your online textbooks, that's awesome. That's great. Um, the advantages of a digital textbook is that if I tell you the page instead of you having to flip to the textbook, you type it in. I can even scan the word and I'll show you how many times it shows up. So when we're talking about rights and freedoms, right? So in the textbook, it defines a right as a legal, moral, or social entitlement due to all people because they are human beings. Now, this is the key point. So rights, or what we call human rights, are given to everyone, irregardless, are meant to be yours, right? Governments do not give you rights. They merely recognize the rights you have as a human being. Okay, so this is a very interesting concept that needs to be better explained. So let's say we live in Canada and let's say we live in country B, right? And country B says that women can't drive, women aren't allowed to vote. Country B, it says people who are born of a specific race, black people aren't allowed to own property. It says people who are South Asian must be inside their homes by 7 p.m. sharp. Just a bunch of these rights that just a bunch of restrictions on people. Now, as a human being, I have what are called inalienable rights. These are rights that are given to me the day I'm born. When I'm born as a human being, those rights the rights that we're talking about, the legal, moral, social entitlements, are due to me, right? There's no argument. I'm human, I get them. However, where I live, those rights can be either recognized or not. So in Canada, we recognize human rights. There are some that sometimes now that's not always been the case, and sometimes we've had to drag the Canadian government and people to move towards recognizing human rights for all peoples, not just people that look like them, but people who sometimes may not look like them or may not believe like them or may have different lifestyles. Canada has had a long process of dragging people to understand that those rights are inalienable and they cannot, you don't give them, you recognize them. However, as a human being who has these rights, when I travel to country B, no matter while I have those rights, that government will not recognize them. And therefore, it makes my life difficult there because it's a lack of recognition of those rights. However, you have those rights. They're not given to you. No country can give and take away rights. They merely recognize them. And their advantage of a country recognizing them is they have the authority and power to do so. If they don't recognize your right to vote, they can put police officers or use military force to prevent you from voting. If they don't believe your right to free speech, they can shut down any type of political conversation, activities, or meetings. They can do that. However, as we've seen throughout history, when people's human rights are being violated to a way that people have had enough, they then can choose to recognize their own rights against that government. And while there still are oppressive governments within our society, and there are parts of Canadian society that have not always done the best at recognizing human rights, the ability, governments cannot, and I truly believe that, cannot stand up against people who just have had enough and their rights need to be recognized. So in Canada, these rights we talk about are human, they're yours, right? People may want to not recognize them, but you've always had them and you always will have them. Freedoms is something different. The ability to conduct one's affairs without being hampered or frustrated. So freedom means that I can go about my business without something impeding me, right? So freedom of speech, which means I can go and express an idea or without the government saying you can't do that, you can't say that, you can't go here. Freedom of association, I can join any group I want without having the fear that that individual or that group, I'll be in trouble if I join that group. Those are freedoms, right? That we have. Both are part of our Constitution, right? Now, as we scroll down here, I'm not going to read this part. You're going to read it on your own about the historical documents. But, all right, Magna Carta was signed by King John in 1215, and its first step was establishing a basic individual rights for people of England. So that's the first point in England where people are recognizing human rights. Up until that point, right? It's not really there. And it's not as if they rolled out human rights at that point and everyone got them. They were still very limited. It still was a small group of people, but as it became the idea of inalienable, that means they belong to everybody and they exist regardless of government recognition. It allowed the door to be open for people to expand those rights. Okay, so and I'll use the American Constitution for example. The American Constitution has a beautiful introduction. It says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Right? It's a beautiful idea. The first passage is, the preamble is great, but later on in the Constitution it says women, indigenous groups, and Black people are 3/5 human, therefore it doesn't apply to them, right? However, when you have the first part, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, then it allows people to say, but I'm a person, I have to be equal. They're a person, they have to be equal. It allows a foothold within the system because the law says if we're all equal, then you cannot own people. You cannot treat people differently because of their gender. You can't treat people because of their race. You can't treat people because of their sexual orientation. You can't treat people differently because of their religion. It allows the idea to push and breathe and grow, right? So here it kind of talks about the evolution of the rights of Canada. So it just talks about the different stages in which different people were granted different human rights. So again, we've had a history that's not been great. Now, we know in 1833, slavery was abolished by the Emancipation Act, but then you have the Indian Act, which basically takes indigenous peoples and makes them wards of the state, right? You have the Chinese Immigration Act that basically says to become a citizen in Canada and you're Chinese, you have to pay money. But as you notice when you look through this chart, that there is a slow growth in it recognizing human rights for individuals, right? And the change towards to expanding the idea of human beings and their rights and privileges, right? So it's, again, we did not start out with the idea of Canada being the perfect nation or the nation that we exist in today. The Canada that was first formed and the Canada we live in today are two different Canadas. But the charter or the idea of Canadian Bill of Rights and idea of people pushing forward allow those rights to be expanded, okay? Our system is a little different because while the Americans have a constitution that's hundreds and hundreds of years old, Canada doesn't necessarily have that one as long, or part of it. Our constitution consists of two things. There is the BNA Act, which is the British North American Act of 1867, and that was established and created. That just basically told, here are the rules of Canada. Here's the guideline, here's the playbook, here's who has power, here's what the federal government means, this is what the provincial government does, this is what happens, it's just a basic rule book of how our country runs. Right? Now, because we followed British law, they had a constitution, but it was unwritten, which simply meant that every decision they made created a set of rules or guidelines about human rights. So therefore, you don't have to write them down. It's all part of British law. Okay? Canada had a Bill of Rights that was created by the federal government, but because it's not entrenched or it's not made reason to the idea of a constitution, it can be changed, right? It can be altered. You can add things and take things out, and that wasn't good. It took up until about 1982 where Canada needed to repatriate, or Canada wanted to create its own constitution because we had been following, we had still been a part of the British Commonwealth. We still had ties to them. We still made decisions in Canada had to be approved by their Supreme Court, it took to 1982 to repatriate our Constitution, which meant was it took until that time for us to create our own Constitution and say, this is how our country is going to be run. And in our 1982 document, we established our Constitution, right? What are our rights and freedoms that we are going to recognize? And that is the establishment of our Constitution. So our Constitution is technically 1982, even though there's this other component that's always existed in Canada, but that was more about the operation of the Canadian government and what it meant to be Canadian citizen, or what it meant to be who had control over which part of society, depending upon the level of government. Okay. So again, here's just a list of things that changes that that were brought about, and also things that were violations of human rights, right? So you have like good things like in 1929, where the famous five fight for and get women to recognize as persons, because if you know so the history of the Persons cases, there was a woman who was going to be named a judge, and someone said women can't be judges, they're not people, and then they argued that, well, then what are we? Okay, but again, you have these really, really horrible things like the internment of Japanese peoples during World War II, when there has been no evidence that I'm aware of that they were planning to do anything during World War II to aid the Japanese at all. But still put them in prison, took their land, took their property, released them from prison, tried to ship them back over at the end of World War II, even though some of them have, were born in Canada, have no connection to Japan, and then refused to give back their money and property. Just say, it's gone, too bad, so sad. Okay, so this is the history, and I encourage you to read this because it's very important to understand how our country, especially because we tend to think of ourselves as the great nation that doesn't do anything wrong, how human rights and the fight for human rights and the fight for a constitution that recognizes them is a long, arduous one. It's not just one that appears magically because we're special. People had to constantly push and push and push using the document itself to recognize people's human rights. Okay, so all you guys will read this on your own, it's not here. Entrenching rights and freedoms. When we mean entrench, we just simply mean that the idea is that the Constitution is considered to be the highest law of the land. And the pyramid that I drew, I don't know if it's on the board, but I drew it when class first started, that's the highest part of the land, which means nothing can overturn a constitutional decision. When it's entrenched, it means that those things in the Constitution cannot be changed easily. It doesn't mean it cannot change. People see constitutions as living and breathing documents, which meant that they believe the constitutions were designed to change as a society changes, right? As things happen. One of the examples I always use is that if we ever, in 100, we're still around 100, 200 years, we start creating artificial life that could think for itself, that was alive and had consciousness, we would have to come up with things, they would have to be included in our charter because they're not human, but do they have rights? If a machine can think, does it have rights? Anyone want to point in? Anyone want to say anything? If I can create an android that thinks and feels, does the android have rights?
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
Yeah, because, and again, I'm like Star Trek, and there's a whole episode where Data is an android, and they're going to take him apart to study him, and the whole thing, he has to go before Starfleet or their courts to say, does Data have the right to say no? Because they're saying, well, he's a machine, he doesn't have a right to say no. And he had to prove his consciousness, right? And the argument came down to, hey, I have no idea if Data has a soul. But then again, I don't know if anyone has a soul. What makes Data different from me? Right? And again, we've had science fiction deal with the idea that just because you create a machine, does it mean it has less rights than you? So this is something that as we move forward, and let's say we develop this, we would have to deal with within our Constitution, right? Right. The way we've expanded to include women and people of color and people of different religions. We are now excluding rights to deal with people who are transgendered, people who do not, who are non-binary. These were not concepts that people thought about when we created our Constitution. But now we need to think about that because we're recognizing that those individuals exist, and the Constitution needs to recognize them because they are people, right? I still remember when I was a kid, the idea of gay marriage was not can happen. No, 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 no. I remember people voting against it, and now it's like, well, why wouldn't it happen, right? It's a change within my lifetime of not only just attitudes, but courts saying you can't discriminate people based upon, you cannot tell people they cannot get married based upon issues of gender, or saying that two men can't get married, because they're saying the system of marriage, right? Not your religious, but the legal concept of marriage is something that should be applied to everybody. Okay, so it's changing, it's going over, it's doing the entrenching. And now, again, any law that violates the Constitution, it's overridden, which means if your law does not match up with the goals of the Constitution or doesn't follow what the rules of the Constitution are, it gets thrown aside. So it is a very powerful tool. It is a tool used by individuals, right? You, me, everyone. If we think our government has overstepped its bounds, we use the Constitution to seek remedy, to say that what you're doing violates our rights. And that can't happen because human rights are very important and individual rights need to be protected. So that's the part of the Constitution, is that it's an aspect of that, right? One more thing, because I'm talking a lot, and I'm not going to talk about enforcement. Again, it just talks about the fact that in our Constitution, Section 24(1) gives people the right to challenge the government. And that's why you would go to the Supreme Court of Canada. Well, not really. There's different stages of appealing a case, and Supreme Court is the last stage. So you would go to a couple lower courts, and sometimes they would make decisions. Now, a lot of decisions about our human rights or rights in general are decided by lower courts, right? They get to a certain point, there's a decision, people kind of don't push it forward. Some people continue to push it forward because they want to appeal the decision of the court. If the court makes a mistake or doesn't interpret the law correctly, it can be appealed to a different level. Supreme Court is the one that makes all decisions. Right now in Canada, they're making a decision on whether or not the carbon tax is unconstitutional, right? It's a very big decision because if they say it is not constitutional, that means governments cannot impose a carbon tax, right? Which is the key to many people who are environmentalists who are saying this is going to help us with our dealing with climate change. If it says it's totally constitutional, you can create common, you can allow for carbon taxes, it doesn't violate the Constitution, then that argument is over, which means a federal government can say, here's your carbon tax, suck on it, too bad, so sad. So these things help determine how our country is happening right now. In the States, there's a big fight over the Supreme Court justice, and what it means that if you add another justice who tends to interpret the Constitution in a more conservative manner, it will change how the country is going to run for decades, because it may take decades for another judge to be appointed and therefore to be laws to be reinterpreted. I just want to point out one thing, and it talks about the rights of the Supreme Court. Like it says, what's the role of it? And it says the three things the Supreme Court always determines before they make a case. They say, before they make a decision or want to listen to a case, they say, first off, was the right infringed or violated by the government or its agencies? So the charter only covers governments and people. If Willowwood violated your rights, you would not go to the charter. You would go to the Ontario Human Rights Commission, right? Because that's a private business imposing on you. Even though we are in the, we deal with education, we're not a government agency. Is the right in question covered under the charter? Which means, does the right we're talking about, is it actually in the charter? If it's not, they can't really do anything about it. And last, is the violation or infringement within reasonable limits? And I'm going to talk a little bit about this before I end my spiel. And it talks about if the violation of the charter has occurred, the court must decide if the violation can be justified under Section 1. So it just talks about the fact that something unique in our Constitution, which I will discuss in a minute when we focus on Section 1, because we'll do fundamental freedoms tomorrow, but I want to talk about Section 1. And here's just sort of just a case test. But here's what happens. So when we look at our Constitution, I think the preamble, and we'll look at the preamble later, and it says, whereupon Canada, we believe in the rule of law and supremacy of God. So the Constitution says that we believe in two things. One, that no one is above the law, and two, God is supreme, right? Now, which God you believe in, which style of God you believe in, at that time, they're talking about Judeo-Christian God, but now it's just saying that there is some sort of higher power. Canada recognizes that we're all equal before the law, and there is a supreme being. And it says that basically Canada Canada can pass that the people have fundamental freedoms and liberties that cannot be entrenched, except for what's called Section 1 Reasonable Limits Clause. So what it means here is that in our Constitution, we say that you have these rights. However, the Supreme Court, one of their jobs is to examine if the limitation on your rights is reasonable, which means, is it okay to sometimes limit your rights if there's a reasonable reason for it? And if there is a violation of, so if it does not pass what's called the Section 1 test or the Oakes test, there are 3 questions or 4 questions you're asked about limiting a right. If it does not pass those questions, all of them, then the right has been infringed and it's overturned. If it passes all 4 questions, then there's a reasonable limit to the right, which means saying, I know your rights are limited, but there's a reason, right? The Oakes test answers these four questions. Is the reason for limiting the charter rights must be shown to be important enough to justify overriding a constitutionally protected right. So the reason why we're limiting isn't important. Is it important enough that we are actually willing to override your right because there's something in society that we need to cover? 2, there must be a rational connection between the limitation of the right and the objective of legislation. By doing this act, will it allow me to, this limitation, will it match up with the objectives of the law that I'm having, okay? 3, the right must be limited as little as possible, which means, look, it can't cover everything. It has to be focused on addressing that specific issue. And 4, the more severe the rights limitation, the more important the objective must be, which means it must be super important to limit your rights. Now, can anyone think of something that would represent a limitation under Section 1? And just guess, be thinking, you know, if you don't know it, that's cool. Can anyone guess? Because I can tell you one that totally proves Section 1 is reasonable. Ooh. Anyone want to guess? Random guess. Okay, here's one. In a court case, and I'll tell you about this. Do I have it here? Is it here? Is it here? Is it here? Where's that little? So what proves this specific right or specific Section 1 right is a case called R versus Keegstra. Now, R versus Keegstra was a case in which a teacher in the Alberta school system was teaching his kids that the Holocaust didn't happen. He was teaching the kids that, yeah, this isn't real, that it was over-exaggerated, that 6 million Jews didn't die during World War II, blah, 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 blah. He taught it so much that he would put it on his test, and if you chose to write the opposite, he would penalize you with marks, right? So people's, so he got fired. Now, he appealed his case and said, look, I can express my personal opinions any way I want. You are impeding upon my freedom of expression. You can't do that. I'm a historian. I'm making a historical argument. You can't impede upon it. Right? So it went before the Supreme Court, and they said, you know what? You're absolutely right. Limiting your freedom of expression was done by the government. They did violate your rights. However, in all four of those things, they said the limitation was reasonable. So therefore, you can't say what you want to say and do that because we're trying to prevent hate speech. We're trying to prevent the rising of a fascist government. So we're going to limit you, your freedom of expression based upon those things, right? That's a legal aspect of it. Here's a very simple one. If you're in a movie theater, when we could go to movie theaters, could you just yell fire?
Not legally.
Right. Why not?
Because that would induce mass panic within the theater and could kill multiple people.
Right, but isn't it my right to express myself any way I want? I just said
theoretically, fire. But there are certain restrictions to that, such as not inducing, like, because that would cause unneeded danger. Correct?
Right, absolutely. Because Quinn, what you're saying is that my rights have limits. Right? Don't we all? There are limits, right? I cannot yell fire in a crowded theater if there's no fire. Right? I cannot, in Canada, there are hate law speeches. I cannot get up and promote something that talks about murdering people of a different cultural group or sexual identity, orientation, or religion. I can't do that. That's a limitation. Even though I'd say, but I feel this way, why can't I express it? It's a limitation on my rights. And in Canada, the first thing we say in our Constitution is, look, these rights are all yours, and you do have them, but there are limits you have to acknowledge in order to protect the whole, right? So it's easy for Keekstra, because he's an old racist dude, we don't care, right? He's anti-Semitic, we don't care if we limit his rights. But the idea is that we're doing it because it is more important for our society that we don't have a person creating an environment that could lead to genocide than their ability to express their political opinions, whatever they may be. Okay? Rights have limits. And in our Constitution, we say your rights are wide and broad, but they have limits, and governments can limit them if there is a reasonable there's a reasonable thing. Focusing on hate crime laws, they can say is reasonable, right? Pornography, we can limit that because it's reasonable, right? It's focused and we're doing it for a reason to prevent this other thing from happening. It might infringe upon your rights, but there's a reason for it. Okay? Can anyone think of something else that we're living in right now that's putting a limit on our freedoms, that it's reasonable?
Maybe the amount of alcohol we consume before we can drive. So like it's only like one bottle of beer. Or
yeah, I mean that's a lot of mistake. Yes, because yes, you put people. So can you drink whatever you want? I guess you can, in your home, sure, but you can't get into a car because you'll kill somebody, right? It's a limit. You can't do that. You can't say, well, I'm just driving. I'll take my own risk. You're saying society that if you get into a car, you might kill yourself, but you could kill someone else. We're limiting you, right? What about something else that we have to do right now, maybe for another 6 months to a year, because we have to, and it's a limit. You're all wearing them right now, except for me, because I'm at home.
Wear a mask.
Right, because now, should you have the right to wear what you want? Of course you should. But they can say putting a mask on is a reasonable limitation. And what's the reason behind it? there is a virus that's going around that no one has an immunity to, and we have no treatment for. So the only thing that works is stay 6 feet away, stay an NBA point guard away from you, and wear a mask. Wash your hands. Someone could say, you're violating my rights. I am. However, it's a reasonable limitation to do. You can sit there and say, I'm limiting your rights because of that. Those are reasonable, right? So remember, in our Constitution, we acknowledge the fact that your freedoms have limits. Now again, because I have some anti-Americans leaning sometimes, so take that statement into consideration when I say that. I find the American Constitution tends to go the other way, that your individual freedoms should override everything. And that doesn't seem to make much sense to me, because it doesn't lean into the idea that there are limits to everything, because we live in a group of a society, right? So the anti-maskers in both Canada and States can't run around saying, I don't like this, and yell in my face, because you can't do that, because you have to have a limit. You can't say, it doesn't matter, there's a pandemic, I can do what I want. You can't stop me. Okay, but there should be a reasonable limit to your behavior, correct? Anyone? Does anyone disagree, agree, before I end this little
Yeah. I
spiel?
agree.
Okay, why?
Pardon?
Okay, Helen, why? I can't see you because we're screen sharing. Actually, I'm going to stop this because I think we're done this part. I'm gonna stop.